When developing the story arc for this episode, the original title was Truth. However, after recognizing how central the characters were to what was happening, I landed not unironically on Ruth. 4 of 5 letters are the same. There's only one additional mark, a letter T or a plus sign, depending upon how you look at it. Either way, Ruth contributes to this story in ways we likely would never have known. However, her correspondence becomes central to the theme, nearly 4 decades later. Interestingly enough, she seemed resigned to accept her role, as I have mentioned here, as Auntie Ruth. However, that was changing, and the times were changing too. Things in the 1950s did not offer forth the opportunities for communication like we have today. There were no podcasts, no speeches, no public reckonings, no social media. What there was instead was control. She lived in a world that prized composure above confession and stability above truth. A world where private knowledge could be dangerous if handled openly, and where discretion was not just a virtue, but a survival skill. When something fractured, she did not ask who was at fault. She asked what could be managed. Ruth likely learned early that anger accomplished little, and the explanation invited scrutiny, so she moved quietly. She relied on systems and institutions like marriage and family. She might not confront parental guidance. She might not expose a secret. She might not rewrite the past. But she did have an opportunity, even if fleeting, to reorder the future. She could now move information to her adult child. In a world that questioned her judgment, she chose to cling to hope. After all these years, she could change things. To modern ears, this kind of thinking can sound passive. But in the 1950s, it was often the only form of agency available. Society taught at incalculable cost to protect the family reputation, not to unravel it, to ensure continuity, even if it meant silence. It was the method to the madness of the 1950s. With one family secret exposed and a contested will now in motion, it felt as though hope, and even fortune, might be turning at last. No one likely rejoiced more than Auntie Ruth. No one became more communicative when the amended will of Irene Moore was opened. People expected to see familiar names, friends, relatives, long-standing beneficiaries. She too was able to reopen a closed chapter of her life. All because one name was added and now one name was missing. A name so central to Irene Moore's earlier estate plan, so deeply tied to her social circle, so entrenched in the Lyon Moore network, that his absence was not just unusual, it was headline news, and shocking. Dr. James Lyon, a prominent heart surgeon, a respected figure, her husband of 27 years, a man listed prominently in her earlier will, was suddenly, inexplicably, gone. No explanations, no notes, no reasons, just her passing and the consequence. And in his place, a trust, to be managed by a banker. When Irene Moore's amended will surfaced in probate, something strange happened. Instead, the Washington Loan and Trust Company appeared. They were not claiming the estate. They were executing it. Because one thing was clear. Removing a prominent physician like Dr. Lyon, a man included in her earlier estate plan, is no accident. It is deliberate. My grandfather had no reasonable way to know about any of this, and yet, somehow, he did. And somewhere in that swirl, or possibly through a quiet whisper from Auntie Ruth Stoughton, my grandfather, the foster child, became aware that he might have a claim. He might be entitled to something, anything. He would be connected to Dr. Lyon in ways he did not yet necessarily understand. Imagine this moment. A man in Delaware, a school district employee, receives word that he may be connected to an estate. He is in his early 40s, and he does not yet know Betsy, his half-sister. He does not know Dr. Lyon, his biological father. He may not even know the truth of his own origins, but something or someone tells him to investigate, to show up. So he does. He ultimately walks into a world of coal money, trusts, bankers, and erased physicians, a world that does not look anything like the one he came from. The pleadings and legal documents are interesting enough on their own. We will untangle those nuances in future episodes. But for now, let's refocus the lens on Auntie Ruth Stoughton. Unlike Irene Moore, Auntie Ruth has pictures. Not many, but they are certainly findable. A few photographs that reveal a beautiful woman in her own right. The symmetry of her face is almost as striking as her smile. She appears aware of the camera, if not quietly engaged with the photographer through the lens. Her eyes are piercing and warm at the same time, smiling even before her lips do. Her attractiveness is apparent, but it doesn't seem performative. An ease about her expression that suggests a genuinely friendly disposition. She was born in Montague, Massachusetts, in September of 1886, and in July of 1911, at the age of 24, she gave birth to one Foster Wayne Stoughton Lyon. Dr. Lyon, at the time, described himself as the assistant superintendent and physician for the Massachusetts State Sanatorium for Tuberculosis in Rutland, Massachusetts, from 1909 to 1916. In 1911, distance did not mean disconnection. It meant intention. Montague and Rutland were not worlds apart. They were roughly 60 miles away, linked by railroads. Now it was the transportation device connecting people in ways that were difficult to imagine just a generation earlier. Physicians traveled, especially physicians tied to the state. Dr. Lyon listed himself as a physician at the state sanatorium during these years. That role did not confine him. It enabled him. And in July of 1911, a child is born. Foster is the child. Stoutton, like Lyon, was one of the eldest siblings in a very large family, confirmed through multiple sources. By most accounts, she had 9 younger brothers and sisters, and at least one older sister. The last child in her family was born when she was 16. It is easy to believe that she helped with child-rearing responsibilities in the early 1900s. Interestingly, because census dates are taken every 10 years, there is no clear indication that Foster, as a child, was living with the family. We have records for the decades, from 1900, 1910, and 1920. However, there is a window from Foster's birth in 1911 onward, when it would have been reasonable to expect that another child could be introduced into the family mix without any accounting. The Stouttons had the perfect cover to assimilate Auntie Ruth's foster child into their family unit. We can assume her mother was willing. But given the child's naming convention and what happened later, I suspect her father, William Canning Stoutton, felt much differently. He was a farmer by trade, and at the age of 52 had been married for 25 years. In the 1910 census of the William C. Stoutton family, only 6 of his children are listed, only males. He does list his wife, Mary Stoutton, she too at the age of 52. However, she is the only woman listed, despite later evidence of as many as 4 other sisters in the family at the time. Women could not vote until the 19th Amendment granting women's suffrage was ratified in 1920. In 1910, records did not just document families, they protected them. Sons were named because names carried property rights, legacy, and familial continuity. When a woman's story complicated reputation, timing, or inheritance, the solution was not confrontation. It was an omission. No lies, no denials, just absence. So when a census lists only sons, it does not tell us who mattered most. It tells us that there was a reason for omission. Because in families with something to lose, silence was not shame. Silence was a strategy. Silence was golden. Naming conventions, however, spoke loudly. William Stoutton was a man tasked with protecting a clan, a family name. And then came a child he did not create, born not outside the family but uncomfortably within it. The child of Ruth Stoughton, his daughter, and Dr. James Lyon. William Stoutton had little choice but to bring that child into the household. It would help protect his family name, and it likely was not his choice alone. In families like this, the heart of the family often enters via the wife. Through insistence, through conscience, the child would be fed, sheltered, educated, but the child would never be mistaken as one of Stoutton's own. Everyone would know what he was, and that would be defined by what he was called. They named him Foster, a foster child embedded in the Stoutton family. Not just a role, but a moniker of that era, a designation that offered care without belonging. He was not cast out, he was contained. And that was a name I, too, would later learn to live with. Foster James Flint. Names do not stay in the past. They follow you. Each year, teachers read names the same way they always had, out loud, one by one. And some names land differently, Foster, as a first name. It was an easy punchline, an easy nickname, something that suggested you wouldn't be there for long. So classmates laughed. Teachers stumbled over it. Everyone was asking questions for which there were no answers at the time. Eventually, I chose another name to go by, Jimmy. My mother didn't know this story. She didn't need to. She simply felt what I felt. And only later did I realize that in choosing that name, I was learning something my grandfather had learned long before me. As she protected me with my nickname, the Stoutton family legacy was protected by giving a child a name he was forced to bear, Foster. While Ruth Stoughton and Dr. Lyon may have shared similar interests and a child, they differed in where the years would take them after my grandfather's birth. Lyon had a world to conquer, and Ruth's father wanted her to move on and marry without the scarlet letter of a child holding her back. Ruth finds a relationship beyond Dr. Lyon in her subsequent marriage to Walter Wheelwright in December of 1913, a milkman, as detailed in census and wedding records. However, it is apparent that the exchange of vows did not include our foster child. Foster likely stayed behind with the expansive Stoutton family. He may have known Auntie Ruth, but he did not know her as a parent. Then, in 1918, Mary Stoutton, Ruth's mother, passed away, and that is when something else changed. It was time for our foster child to leave, only for Ruth Stoughton to later return. There are plenty of markers in place to substantiate this. For example, in the 1920 census, at the age of 34, Ruth Stoughton is listed as residing in Montague with her family and as a teacher. Her loving, kind eyes, and later her perfect penmanship, suggest someone willing to share life with others, someone to give the gift of learning and living. Her relation to the head of household in this census, for the first time, daughter. William Stoutton had lost a wife, but regained a daughter. Through that exchange, though, Foster was not there. There is no mention of Foster in any of the census data. There is no readily available evidence that Auntie Ruth had any other children, but who was caring for our foster child? Later documents confirm the sheer amalgamation of names my grandfather bore: Foster, Wayne, Lyon, Stoutton, which ultimately turned into Foster James Flint, Sr. Among the myriad of combinations, he started as and would forever be labeled a foster child, even if he wasn't one. A quick refresh of our timeline reminds us that, in 1948, Dr. Lyon was attempting to acknowledge his child in a world that was changing. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, the will was then changed in June of 1949. In September 1950, Irene Moore Lyon passed away. That is when the documented correspondence from Auntie Ruth begins. There's a letter addressed to 509 Pleasant Street in Melrose, Massachusetts. The postmark is February 11th, 1951, well before the trial, which will begin later, the same year. Inside is a photo, a black and white photo. The foster child is now a fully formed adult, receiving the correspondence and his own childhood photos. He is almost 40 years old. It is a photo of Foster Wayne Lyon Stoutton. Foster looks to be 6 or 7 years old. A child, wearing the most amazing cowboy outfit, chaps, a hat, a small play pistol, unmistakably my grandfather. The photo was taken on the steps, in front of a window, after Auntie Ruth had moved away, but before Mary Stoutton had passed. He is dressed like a Western cowboy, not because the cowboys were popular on television. There were none. Not because it was cute. This was not play acting. Cowboys were heroes then. Strength without inheritance. Identity without pedigree. In an era shaped by war and myth, a cowboy was what you dressed a boy in when you wanted him to look like he belonged, even if his name said otherwise. Long before anyone called him a foster child, Mary Stoutton, Ruth's mom, dressed him as something more dynamic. The letter, though, comes from and is signed by Auntie Ruth. She did not call herself mother. She did not disappear either. She chose a relational name that kept her far enough away to avoid questions, yet close enough to love from afar. Auntie Ruth. Although I never spoke of this with my grandfather, what comes next shapes the man he ultimately becomes. Foster Sr. certainly knew the Stoutton family. He knew his Auntie Ruth. But something changed in 1918. Something signals that it is time for the foster child to leave his childhood home. The catalyst is the impending death of Mary Stoutton, which ultimately happens on October 4th, 1918. His acceptor, his grandmother, his protector. She dies. Auntie Ruth had married and was away from the family. William Stoutton would have been left to manage the foster child and the family without his wife. They would have been left to fend for themselves. One, a hard-nosed farmer, and our foster child, that we can reasonably surmise by later activities that the farmer did not want. In the Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne wears a red letter A, so the community does not have to look too closely at itself. The shame is visible, contained, managed, But when William's wife is gone and the mother, too, has moved on with her life, well, the choices are few. The burden of care does not vanish. It looks for a new place to land, and for this foster child, it would not be with the Stoutton family. The grandfather does not need a red letter stitched to a coat. He already had a word for it. The child already had a name, foster, a foster child forevermore, a designation that says you are cared for, but not claimed. Hawthorne knew this too. In his novel, when the red letter A is removed, the system does not repent. It reassigns the mark. The societal structure that allowed the harm never admits fault. It simply reorganizes itself to continue functioning. And that is where Mary Jane Flint and the ghost of another good doctor enter the picture, Dr. Omar Alpha Flint.